War is the continuation of politics by other means, and nowhere is this more evident than in Turkey's involvement in the Syrian battlespace. Although policymakers in Ankara have genuine interests in Syria and see the ongoing fight as an exercise of geopolitics, the stakes are even higher for the Turkish president. For Erdogan, Syria is also about political survival, as it defines his endgame. I'm your host Shirvan, and welcome to Caspian Report. In the spring of 2011, when Syrians first took to the streets to protest against the rule of President al-Assad, Erdogan was busy introducing religious substance in the national educational curriculum of Turkey. The secular opposition had just turned to infighting, and Erdogan's ruling party, the AKP, was riding a wave of populism that seemed unstoppable. Be that as it may, when Syrian refugees arrived in the thousands on Turkish soil, Erdogan's domestic plans were disturbed. Slowly but assuredly, as the number of Syrian refugees in Turkey increased by the hundreds of thousands, Ankara was being drawn into the affairs of Damascus. By the time the number of Syrian refugees in Turkey eclipsed 1 million, Erdogan's attitude towards al-Assad had changed dramatically. The Turkish government began arming, training and funding opposition forces doing battle against the al-Assad government. Soon enough, Turkey became a haven for the Syrian opposition, as well as a conduit from where foreign jihadists made their way into Syria. When the jihadist forces gained a foothold in Syria and Iraq, the flow of refugees inflated. Millions of Syrians fled to Turkey, and the state was forced to construct vast camps with all the logistics to host the new arrivals. Turkey doesn't get the credit it deserves when it comes to the Syrian refugees, but the country has taken in more refugees than any other nation, more than the entire Arab world combined, and more than all of the European Union. Erdogan convinced the Turkish public that accepting refugees was an act of morality, compassion, and solidarity. The narrative worked, and political opposition to the influx of refugees remained mute. But since day one, there was an inescapable truth to this equation. Turkey could not host the Syrian refugees indefinitely. The 2014 presidential election was a rude awakening for Erdogan. He managed to win at least 51% of the vote, enough to get re-elected, but he had lost the confidence of voters from the southeast of Turkey, which was predominantly Kurdish. The pro-Kurdish HDP and its chairman Demirtas had chipped away at Erdogan's popular vote. A year later, Erdogan's AKP had lost its majority in the parliament for the first time in over a decade. Again, a loss that was brought about due to the success of the HDP, which continued to win over Kurdish votes. Being a man of shrewd politics, Erdogan changed his strategy. While earlier he led genuine peace talks to reconcile with the PKK separatists in order to appease Kurdish voters, which came close to a peace deal, after the HDP blowback, however, Erdogan struck a political alliance with Turkish nationalist MHP to secure a majority rule. The nationalist faction had only one policy. They strongly opposed reconciliation with the PKK. As Erdogan capitulated to the nationalist demand, years of peace talks with the PKK came to an abrupt end. The president's policy of accommodation and reconciliation made a U-turn and went full anti-Kurdish. Thus, arguably, the rise of the pro-Kurdish HDP was perhaps the worst thing that could have happened to the needs of the Kurdish voters. Subsequently, Turkey's objective in Syria shifted according to the AKP's alliance with the MHP. Instead of regime change in Damascus, priority was given to deny the YPG, which had links to the PKK, from establishing an autonomous state in northeastern Syria. Erdogan, who was now in partnership with Turkish nationalists, shifted insurgents from Aleppo, Hama, Homs, and Idlib in west and northwest Syria to attack the YPG in the northeast instead. In 2016, when al-Assad's army retook the city of Aleppo and other major cities, Erdogan had redirected the Syrian rebel forces to the YPG front lines. It was a striking change of policy, so much so that by 2017, Erdogan was back to working with al-Assad as well as Russia and Iran to create a new balance of power in Syria, one that excluded the YPG. The Astana peace talks established several de-escalation zones where all belligerents would abide by a local ceasefire. However, in practice, with the blessing and backing of Putin, al-Assad frequently violated the truce and made small but numerous military gains. Meanwhile, Turkey launched its own military incursion into the YPG-controlled Afrin area, while the Russians, Syrians, and Iranians looked the other way. Erdogan's policy on Syria wasn't the only thing that changed according to the political landscape. In the 2019 municipal elections, the AKP lost control in nearly all major cities, including Istanbul. 2 decades ago, Erdogan had acted as the mayor of Istanbul. Now he could not even muster the popular vote over the city he once governed. The 2019 municipal election was a significant blow to Erdogan, and perhaps the weakest point in his political profession in over 25 years. Part of the AKP's failure was rooted in the lira's currency crisis, which was brought on by bad loans. The other part was due to the growing public discontent with the presence of 3.6 million Syrian refugees on Turkish soil. Being pious and acting with a moral compass is easier in times of abundance, but when faced with an economic crisis, people tend to blame the unfamiliar for their grievances. Turkey's open border policy towards Syrian refugees was always meant to be a temporary resolution. The currency crisis, however, had depleted the public's patience, and Erdogan, being the politician he is, acted accordingly. To regain public trust and convince future voters, Erdogan adjusted his refugee policy. Turkish security agencies set up a hotline to gather information on illegal immigrants, while law enforcement services stepped up house searches and the detention of illegal Syrian refugees, with the goal being to relocate the refugees out of the major cities. Much like his U-turn on Kurdish policy, Erdogan's agenda shifted according to the new political tides. He no longer portrays himself as a patron of the pious, but as a nationalist who wants the Syrian refugees to go back to their broken homes. The trouble, and this is something they learned in Europe as well, is that refugees have inalienable rights according to international law. One cannot merely resettle millions of refugees back into a war zone. The Turkish solution for this conundrum is to carve out a large enough buffer space along Syria's border with Turkey. The envisioned safe zone would sit east of the Euphrates River and measure at a length of about 370 kilometers and a depth of 32 kilometers. An area large enough to host at least 2 million refugees and thereby rid Erdogan of a political liability that are the Syrian refugees. The Turkish plan includes the construction of some 200,000 homes, as well as institutions for security, education, healthcare, religion, and recreation. All of it would be internationally funded, but the construction projects would be licensed to Turkish firms, which would provide the Turkish GDP growth rate with some serious points. The overall plan kills 2 birds with 1 stone. It settles the refugee question while reanimating the economy. The ruling party in Ankara hopes that this will win back the popular vote. In a Turkey that is cash-strapped and where anti-Arab sentiment is rising, the government feels the pressure to illustrate to its public that it is not prioritizing foreign refugees over its own citizens. Thus, despite all the flaws Erdogan's plan withholds, and despite the lack of funding, the president is pushing the agenda regardless. The irony is that Washington and Brussels are now criticizing Ankara's harsh attitude towards Syrian refugees, while they themselves have essentially locked their borders. Erdogan, who is increasingly isolated by his former allies, has been left to deal with the brunt of the refugee dilemma on his own. In response to this damned if you do, damned if you don't narrative, the Turkish president recently stated that he would open the gates and ignite a new refugee crisis in Europe if no aid is given to Turkey. The tense political standoff illustrates just how far their relations have depreciated. All in all, Turkey's endgame in Syria has shifted over the years according to the domestic political needs of the Ankara government. From bolstering religious credentials at home and the overthrow of al-Assad to denying the YPG a state and the resettling of millions of refugees. The Turkish involvement in Syria is perhaps a textbook case of how war and politics complement one another. I've been your host Shirvan from Caspian Report. Credit goes to our gracious community on Patreon for giving us the means to produce content like this. If you want to learn more, visit the links in the description. Thank you for watching, and Sahol.